Hello, everybody. Welcome to the seminar, the last in the series, actually. This is number 11. It's good to see so many people here. And we have a very exciting guest today, Alannah Chance, who is an award-winning audio producer who makes podcasts, radio and documentaries, including Radio 3's Late Junction. So very excited to learn about podcasting and radio programs with her. Before we get going, a few housekeeping things. So this event is taking place in line with Yorkshire Sound Women's Network's Equality, Diversity and Safer Spaces policy. And we are recording this. We're going to put it on YouTube at some point next year. So if you want to keep your camera off, that's absolutely fine. Otherwise, you may be in the recording. And if everyone could please keep on mute, that would be great. There will be plenty of chance to ask questions throughout the presentation. If you have any questions as we're going through, as Alannah's talking, feel free to put them in the chat as well. We're also going to have a break about halfway through. So yeah, that's about everything. Alannah's going to give a really good introduction into her amazing career, and we're also going to have chance at the end for more interaction and discussion. So yeah, so take it away, Alannah. Great to have you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I can see some people I know. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you all. I was wondering, and don't feel like you have to talk, but I'd really like to get a sense of sort of whether people are just interested in podcasts generally, or whether you're maybe making your own stuff. I know quite a few of them maybe musicians and already practitioners in sound in some way. It'd be really great to, if you want to just pop in the chat, like what you're interested in hearing about, or if you've got any questions at any point, actually you can just chuck them in the chat. There'll be, as Emily said, there'll be some breaks for specific questions, but you can just chuck it in. And equally, if you want to say anything, just put your hand up. Does anybody want to share now out loud or in the chat what I'm interested in? Podcasts, radio, whether you're making your own. I work on community heritage. Yeah, Joe. Hi.
Yeah, so I've fairly recently got into making podcasts. So I started off my own podcast called Nature Tripping with my partner, which is kind of like slow radio where we go outside into nature and talk about it. And I've also been editing the Yorkshire Sound Women Network's podcast. So not doing the production side of things, but doing the sound editing. And that's kind of got me interested in the whole kind of art of building a soundscape around the narrative. Because when I listen to other people's podcasts, I can hear music coming in, sound effects, music going out again, different voices coming in, the ordering of things quite interesting sometimes. So I guess I've become more interested lately in the whole kind of art of creating the structure of a podcast and how the different elements fit together.
Brilliant, great. You're going to enjoy the sound stuff. So I'm going to do an introduction just at the top about me and about sort of my journey and some of the different things I've done on the way to where I am now. And there's going to be lots of audio examples, there's lots of listening. And then at the sort of second half, I'm going to show you a project, and I've deliberately done one that's kind of sound rich, that's got lots of layers, so you can see visually how that works. Because I think, yeah, that's sometimes you can't hear it maybe when you listen to stuff, like how many layers there are that's actually gone into and how you build a scene like that. So definitely something I can do. Great. There's lots of people interested in sound design and developing storytelling. Great. Interested in starting my own. There's quite a few people who've been interested in starting their own or are making stuff. Music, radio, videos, spoken word, more professional platform. Interested in podcasts, not making myself yet. Brilliant. Great. It's the right sort of thing that I've got lined up for you. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sort of hearing your questions and things later on when we do some more practical stuff. So I've got a presentation for the whole thing. But yeah, the first bit is just going to be a bit of an intro on my practice and sort of how I've got where I've got. Just bear with me while I get this up. I'm quite new at the old Keynote, so okay. So let's see if that works. Okay, great. So yes, Alannah Chance is my name. I'm an audio producer. I'm actually freelance at the moment. I'm no longer working for Radio 3 for Late Junction. It's quite a recent development over the summer, actually. So yeah, I'll tell you a bit about what I'm doing now in a bit. But yeah, generally I make podcasts and radio. I've made documentaries, I've done live radio, I've done pre-recorded radio, I've done a bit of everything. I've been in radio for over 16 years now. So yeah, getting into the kind of exec territory where I also sort of train other people up and look after sort of production teams. I'm really interested in creative sound. I'm really interested in telling stories through sound. And so we'll talk a bit more about that at the end practically. And just like where I come from as a person is as a music fan. Really, that's kind of where my passion started. And that's how I got into radio, really, was through being like a music geek and wanting to find something that I could kind of funnel that into. And I'm also a DJ. These are some of the people that I've worked with. So a really broad spectrum of people. I've worked a lot for the BBC, which is, you know, still the biggest employer in audio in the UK. And I've worked across a lot of different stations, which I think is fairly unusual in some ways, because I started at Six Music and then I did a little bit of work at Radio 2, even, and I've done stuff for the World Service, Radio 3. I was in for a long time, for the last 6 years odd. And then things for Radio 4. But then recently, I've sort of started to do a lot more like arts podcasts for arts organisations. It's somewhere I feel like there's quite a lot of freedom and an interest in experimenting with the form and interest in creative sound. So it works well for me as a maker. But equally, you know, I launched the Rough Guides podcast a while ago now, and that went on to win awards and things. So yeah, I've done a lot of different things, and you have to do quite a lot of things as a freelancer to kind of make it work as a radio producer, particularly if you're not doing like news or the kind of big long form things.
Yes, this is generally it. Some people I've worked with. Let me just look at my notes for a sec. So yeah, it's very different. We'll go into kind of the different ways of working with podcasts and maybe a very big institution like the BBC. And making live programmes is obviously a completely different thing to making features. But it sounds like maybe some of you are doing live radio in community radio stations. But yeah, I've done a lot of both. I've done a lot of live radio actually as well. And yeah, I'm currently the one of the audio creatives in residence at Summerset House, making it just at the end of making a series for them. So that's me. But I'd say so overarching everything I do, if there's one thread, it's an interest in the marginal, stories at the fringes, the left field, and really kind of representing things at the more radical end of the arts that aren't necessarily getting a platform elsewhere, and bringing those things to a wide audience. I'm quite keen on that. As you know, Late Junction is definitely, you know, their kind of USP, but equally like doing radical things on Radio 4 I find really exciting. So I wanted to start with a clip from this series, which was a 4-part series I did for Radio 4 in 2019. It was called New Weird Britain, and it was about a kind of new blossoming of kind of radical music and performance art in Britain, sort of despite austerity. And it was presented by John Doran, who's from the Quietus. And this is the beginning of episode 1, hopefully.
Folks, come on in, have a seat, get your shoes off. As you know, it's inflatable, but this is the only hatch for us to get in or out. And when I open it, it's going to start to deflate. So what I'm going to get you all to do is get ready, and we're all going to go in at once. 3, 2, 1, go! I'm inside a giant inflatable attached to a barge on the River Lee. In front of me are futuristic jiu-jitsu fighters dressed in bright yellow latex. A man with a mouthguard in a balaclava dribbles into a bag of shopping.
I wear these maybe 500 pairs of hospital latex bright yellow gloves, which I then individually stuff. It looks a bit like Big Bird, maybe.
A film showing bright pink bottoms sitting on Victoria sponge cakes is projected onto a screen over the stage. And a condom full of water hits me in the face.
There's inflatable vaginas, and slowly I basically take all of these different layers off until I'm just wearing latex underwear and I'm about to climb up on this big plastic hymen.
Right in the centre of it all is one woman, clambering onto a plastic sheet stretched over the audience, starting to crowd surf.
Is that your leg?
I don't want to look pretty when we perform. I sort of want to look a bit weird and ugly. Like a sort of yellow custard alien or something.
Yes, so that was the beginning of the new Great Britain series, 4 parts. It's still up there on Sounds if you want to listen to the full thing. I'm going to come back to that series because there's some sort of interesting ways of layering sound and sort of creating a scene. Even in that intro, there's sort of several layers to it that go into making this, hopefully this kind of completely bonkers world that you kind of just launched in immediately into. And yeah, I think it also, I wanted to start with this because there's another thing that's really important to me in my approach, which is a sense of play and a sense of humour and lightness. And I really love combining the high and the low in my work, basically. That's it's something I find really important, particularly working in more kind of experimental and avant-garde spaces in the arts, to kind of continually have that juxtaposition, because I think it can be quite an intimidating space and it can be quite an elitist space, or a perception of an elitist space, and it can be wrapped up in language that can be quite exclusive. And so I think marrying the kind of very seriousness of this music and these areas, but also like allowing absurdity to happen and allowing humour to happen like it does in the rest of the world, is something that I think I've noticed now ties everything that I do together a little bit. Yeah, so that's that. We'll talk about the sound of that later. So yeah, I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail how I've kind of got to where I've got to, and the privileged position of being able to make really kind of strange stuff and get it commissioned on Radio 4, and make really creative decisions on Late Junction, because I think it's important to look back at things and realise that straight lines don't exist, I guess. I think that maybe the group here is quite further along in their practice, but if there's anybody that's starting out, I kind of always think it's important to emphasise that, that things go in squiggles often, or they go in zigzags, and maybe when people talk about their story in the past tense, there's a sense that it's kind of, totally coherent, and it's not always. So I hope that I can kind of be open about that as well. So this is where I started. The first of a few of boasty photos with celebs. That's David Byrne there at Six Music with my colleague Camilla. I started actually very before I'd even got to Six Music, I started doing community radio. I did community radio in Manchester. I was on the Dole after university, and I did a 10-week course that the Job Centre offered me. And that was a radio production course, amazingly put on by this great organisation that I don't think are going anymore, called Radio Regen in Manchester. And I did that, and I loved it, and I loved working with the kind of really broad range of people who were on that course. And I did a producer job as a sort of part of the training, and I just loved it. And I thought this might be an area that I could marry my sort of obsession with music and kind of a kind of endless curiosity in terms of just like researching arts and culture and telling stories. That was my way in, rather than, I know, some people are just, they loved the chart show and things like that, but mine was actually like loving music and finding radio. And then I did an internship at Six Music, and then I stayed on there freelancing, and then I got a staff job, and I was there for on and off for about 8 years. And I worked across everything, really. I really cut my teeth, and it was a really brilliant place to work. I ended up kind of over that time sort of specialising really, and I kind of found my natural place, which was the more left field end, so the kind of Freak Zone and Gideon Co. And then I ended up doing like features, special sort of themed features, long specials on like music of South Africa and something on subculture and fashion, things like that. And then I went to The Guardian about 2014, and I went to learn how to make podcasts, basically. So I was really interested in learning how to do speech, because I listened to a lot of podcasts and I listened to a lot of Radio 4. So that was kind of really, I was listening to music, and then if I was listening to radio, I'd probably listen to speech radio and Six Music. But and I started, the first thing I did there was this 10-part series called The Biggest Story in the World, which is about climate change. So like a totally different than anything I'd done before. But that brilliant editor there, who then went on to the BBC, Jason Phipps, he kind of gave me a break and put me on this with a producer called Fran Panetta, who's one of the best. I mean, she's just startlingly good. She's probably one of the best producers ever out there. I'm going to play a clip from that in a second. But this, I think the Guardian section, I wanted to talk about a bit more about like the kind of zigzag career a little bit, and maybe how those decisions or those choices get erased in a more simple narrative. But I actually ended up doing like a tech podcast at The Guardian. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but already like you can see I'm not like the most tech savvy. So it was a great joke amongst my friends that I was doing Tech Weekly, but I really enjoyed it. And I think like actually, there's a lot about the arts and society that really tech is not separate from anything we do now. So I did that for a couple of years and I loved it. And at the time I remember thinking, but this isn't in music, this isn't the right choice. But looking back, it taught me a lot, and I'm kind of glad that I took that jump. But then at the same time, I did this series. I was doing lots at The Guardian, lots of different series. And the other one I did towards the end was this NTS Guardian Radio Hour, which was live radio that we then podcasted. And it sort of took a different guest each time. And we did like Stuart Lee and Matthew Herbert and Rich Dawson and Nena Cherry, all sorts of people. So I'm going to play you a clip of the Guardian's Biggest Story in the World. This was about their divestment campaign, which I don't know if anyone remembers. It was a campaign to get people to divest out of fossil fuels. And this episode I produced on the psychology of climate change. And I've got to say that the production, the sound design, is a combination of Chris Wood and Fran Panetta, and it's just so good. Like, I cannot take credit for this incredible production. I did lots of the recording and research, but it was a bit like a team effort. And listening back, I still think there's an incredible use of sound here.
This is the biggest story in the world from The Guardian. And on this week's program, we go right to the heart of the problem. Why do we find it so hard to care?
The trickiest thing about climate change is just knowing that it's this issue that we are all actively turning away from.
Most of us know that climate change is something we should be thinking about. In fact, we feel a bit guilty about it. But the message isn't getting through. And if it's the message that isn't working, then it's the messenger that's getting something wrong. The Guardian is one of those messengers. If their well-resourced, high-profile campaign is going to have an impact this time, they need to do their homework. Otherwise, they're setting themselves up to fail. So what's been the problem so far?
It's just this jargon soup. Carbon capture and storage, CCS.
The words they use just don't make sense to the ordinary person.
The House of Commons Energy and Climate
The
Change.
IPCC and the UNFCCC. So, you scan a news story and all you just see are like a bunch of numbers and acronyms and phrases that you don't know.
Desertification.
I don't know what that means.
The language is off-putting and the imagery doesn't connect. Endless pictures of
Polar bears.
Polar bears.
Polar bears. Polar bears.
Perched on an ice floe.
On a tiny piece of ice.
The lone polar bears.
Which is obviously really sad, but it's not something that you can really relate to yourself.
In fact, The Guardian banned polar bears right from the start. But communications being what they are...
I think on day one we did have a polar bear on an ice floe, but we quickly killed it off. The picture, not the polar bear.
The piece launched with an iceberg, and then we replaced it, and then a polar bear came back up, and if we can't convince our own staff or translate their message to our own staff, that will keep happening.
They come from a different continent. We don't get very close to them. And in a sense, that sums up the problem. Equally, those images of cracked, skeletal cows lying on the mammoth savannah, they're far away from England's green and pleasant land.
Ice, snow, glaciers. It may seem obvious in a way, but at the same time it is very, very bizarre that global warming should be presented through things which are
Polar bears.
icy. I do think it matters very much indeed what we see, because the picture we hold in our heads when we think about something, it's literally what we see in our imagination.
The semiotics of climate change tells us a new language is needed, along with a new set of pictures. But we need to go much, much deeper into all this. Look at our psychology to really understand what's going on.
One of the real peculiarities about climate change is that if you ask people, are you concerned about climate change? The majority of people say yes. A significant number of people say yes, they're very concerned. However, if you go out and you ask people, what are you concerned about? Very few people mention climate change.
Yeah, I can see the irony that they've still used a picture of a glacier for the podcast image. I think if you listen to some of New Weird Britain, you can hear the influence of working with Fran at that stage in my career. She's a musician, she was a composer, and she worked for Radio 3 actually as well beforehand, and you can hear her musical sensibility. She's composing radio, and she taught me to I just watched her editing lots actually, and she always edits with a music bed underneath her speech, so that she you can see her foot tapping, and she's editing like she's making beats almost. And I didn't really understand at the time, because I was like, oh, it's all about just what people are saying. But now I do the same thing, and I can see that she really influenced my way of sort of listening. Very brilliant woman. So that was The Guardian. And then I left The Guardian to join Late Junction in 2016. I was headhunted by Reduced Listening, which is the company that produces Late Junction. It's not an in-house production. We pitched in one of the commissioning rounds, which it's kind of worth knowing that the BBC doesn't produce all of their own content. I think it's about 25% legally they have to give out to other suppliers. And so some programmes are produced by other companies, and that was one of them. And yeah, I mean, God, I still love Late Junction. It's kind of my spiritual home. And I was there for, 5 years? And just recently moved on, actually. So yeah, if you don't know Late Junction, it's a experimental music program. It's kind of the flagship experimental music program on Radio 3. Doesn't really play any classical music, unlike the other Radio 3 programs. And yeah, we play everything from kind of field recordings to free jazz, everything in between. And while I was there, I launched quite a few different live initiatives. So we used to do a stage at End of the Road, which I started 2017 maybe. We did for the last 3 years up until the pandemic. And that's me and Nick there on the left in End of the Road. And did some special programmes. We did special programmes with Laurie Anderson, Shirley Collins, and this one with Robert Wyatt, who's just magical. And I also launched the Late Junction Festival while there, which was a 2-day event in Earth in Hackney in partnership with Barbican. And yeah, how are we doing on time? We're doing all right. Maybe this is just a short clip. It's from Late Junction. It's Robert Wyatt. I just wanted to play this because I think sometimes it's easy to emphasise the things that are complicated and have a lot of sound, and they're really snazzy and great sound design. But I personally think there's an equal power in like simplicity, and a really good interview doesn't necessarily need lots of sound underneath it if you've got the right person. So this is Robert Wyatt on that front, and he's talking about when he first wrote into Radio 3 when he was, I think, 9 or 10, about wobbly voices on the radio.
The only difficulty I had with listening to third programme was proper singing. And I could listen to all the instrumental and everything like that and the sounds. But the singing, first of all, depending on the instrument, with male baritones, I didn't know what note they were doing. They'd be going... I go, well, what? Pick one of those and come back to me, you know what I mean? And I always know, because like people know that's true, because the reason why they love children's choirs is, you know, they think, oh, it's so wonderful. The children are just singing the notes. And then the groans come, la, and you think, stop, listen to the children. Can you not hear? What do you think you are? What's going on here? And there's another thing while I'm at it. Sorry, folks, but it's the thing about the volume thing. They're going... And I think, why are you doing that? I can see, well, it's what you do when you sing. I said, you don't talk like that. I'm just going to make a cup of tea. Where does it come from? I now realise this is just the arrogance of youth. That in fact there's very good reasons why these traditions have arisen. And
but you wrote to ask why is this?
All I wrote to say why do all the singers on third programme have wobbly voices? Yes. That was my question.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my computer is being a bit funny actually. It sort of keeps locking me out of the presentation. Hey ho, that was Robert Wyatt being magic. He was one of the most incredible people I've ever met, and I think what is quite a good thing to think about with this is, like, if you are making a podcast and you know you're doing it yourself and maybe you don't have the time and the budget to layer it with loads of sound design, it's not necessarily what that project needs. Think about who you're going to interview, because it's all about the people you pick then, and then the casting becomes really, really important. And you know, I just didn't want anything to get in the way of him and Verity. Actually, you can listen to him for a 2-hour stint with music in between. So yeah, I'll come back to that, but I think it's really important to kind of not overcomplicate things when they don't need it as well. So just kind of listen to the what each thing needs. That was Late Junction. Okay, good. And this is where I'm at now. So Summerset House, I started in just sort of beginning of summer. I'm the first creative in residence that's coming in to make a new podcast series with the artists who are who have studios there. So Summerset House, if you don't know, is an artist. It's London's only working arts organisation. It bills itself as. So it does exhibitions, but it also has a community, a creative community on site. And it's a really exciting place to work. I love the team there. It's got some really interesting people in the studios. And that series is called The Process. And it's about the ideas that surface out of the middle of a work in progress, which is the kind of privilege, I guess, of sort of seeing artists as they work rather than kind of the end product, which is often what you see if you kind of go to a gallery. That's coming out in January. I might share one of the projects with you when we come to that later. So, you want to make a podcast? At this juncture, maybe I can just stop and have a little pause, and there's been tech stuff, but just if anybody has any questions about any of that, I know that's kind of just me talking about myself, so maybe there isn't anything, but if anybody has anything they want to ask. I can't actually see the chat, so Emily, you might have
feel free everyone to write in the chat, or just turn on your mic and ask out loud if you want to. Okay, maybe there's no questions about that bit.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, Yasmin says, how do you structure a show? Do you follow a certain method?
A radio show, I guess you mean, Yasmin. Sorry, the problem is that my mouse doesn't work, so I mean it does normally, and my battery's about to run out. Sorry, this is incredibly unprofessional. Look at me,
that's absolutely
an audio
fine.
Professional. How do I structure a show? With Late Junction, there's definitely like ways. There's kind of specific targets, I guess, is the brutal word, but they're not that as strict as targets. But there's definitely remits of things that we try to do, and there's it's sort of got the greatest amount of variety as we can, and also there's a kind of emphasis on having different juxtapositions. So it's always a little bit different, but then I try to get as many things in terms of radio shows, in terms of radio programming, which I've not really focused on as much here, but in terms of like music programming, I really like juxtapositions. I really like surprising juxtapositions. It's coming back to that, like having a bit of fun with it. Then I like to start with a really big tune that's kind of a little bit different. It's a bit like DJing. I like to tell stories through three tracks, think about links that other people might not have noticed.
Amy said she's really enjoying the listening so far, and she said, please can you say a little bit about keeping voices audible, i.e. accessible, while adding soundscape and music layers?
That is a good question. That is about mixing, I think, and we will definitely come on to that in a bit more detail with the project. So I'll park that one and show you in practice how you do that. It's all about listening, really, and listening to a mix down as well as your project. But I can show you that in.
Okay, cool. And then this may be also one for later. Maria's asking about which tools you use for podcast editing, or would you outsource that to a different specialist to edit the podcast?
It is a good question. I guess it's something that's maybe not that clear. Is that in radio and podcasts you tend to work by yourself a lot, unlike in other sound or like video film, which tends to have big teams. Apart from that Guardian project, that's probably the biggest project I've ever worked with, but it tends to be, producer, presenter, and then a mixer at the end if you're doing a BBC project. But for podcasts, for clients of mine, I probably will do the mix as well. So you tend to do everything, and that's mixed, that's a mixed blessing. I really enjoy it. It means you're really on top of like every single part of the process. But in terms of editing, it is a real skill. I mean, in America they do have like now specific podcast editors and then producers and then the sound design. They keep it a little bit separate on those big productions. But I tend to edit. I mean, I edit everything. I think I wouldn't really know how to do it if I wasn't editing it, because I'm thinking about the edit as I record and which bits I need to get. So yeah, but again, I'll show you a bit more in practice.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. We had one more question about advice on getting funding and commissions.
Yeah.
Rosie said she's been shortlisted for Radio 4 several times, but never quite made it through. So I'm sure you're the best person to to advise on that.
Yes, that is also something that's coming. So this is all good stuff. This is all on the list. Pitching is the final thing, actually. And cool. I've also got some really good resources for you, which goes really into detail. Another colleague of mine did a separate talk for Summerset House, and I can send you all her slides, so that can give you even more knowledge on that. But yeah, it's a really good question, because you probably want, if you want to make a documentary like the ones that you've heard, you need funding for it, because it's going to be too lengthy to do DIY, or you just can't sustain that sort of thing to do by yourself, I think. So yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that. That's that. Yeah, so let's talk about starting a podcast. Yeah. So what sort of format? I think something that you're probably all a bit further along with this, but I think it's still worth thinking about. And it's actually something that I talk to clients when I start a project, is why it's a podcast. Why is this idea a podcast and not something else? And it's kind of sounds a bit counterintuitive in a way, but I actually think it helps to sort of focus the mind a little bit on the format that you're making, which is audio, and why this story is an audio story. Because I have to say that some stories work better in print or work better in film. I'd say most things can work well. If you pick the right audio format, you can do it justice. But it is worth thinking from the get-go about the fact that you're making something in audio. It's not just something that you're making in audio is kind of like, it just happens to be a podcast. And I think that those are the best podcasts. They use the sound format well. So I'd sort of think about that first. And then once you're in and you're like, yes, this is definitely, I want to make this podcast because it's going to be great, because I want to have these sounds and I want to have these voices in these interviews. Then you want to think about what format. So when I start a project, I tend to talk endlessly about formats, because it helps you to budget your time, and it helps to understand from the get-go kind of what how it's going to work really, and how you can manage the whole team. And these are some of the kind of key questions for that. I mean, there's a lot more detail in this. Obviously, there's places you can go and you can find out more about, like the interview format, the roundtable format, the documentary multi-voice format. I'm not going to go into all of those things, so I'm just going to tell you the kind of key things I think when you're starting something like this to really interrogate. The first one is who is your presenter, or who's telling your story. Now that might be you, that might be yourself, it might be your story. It might be that you're working with a presenter and you're a producer and you want to bring somebody else's story out. Those are the kind of obvious ones, but actually there's other formats which I work a lot with, which is the no presenter, and it's using kind of artists to tell their own story and then weaving it in with other voices. That's a bit more of a production skill, but I like having people tell their story in their own words. It's just a style that I enjoy, like working with people in that way. But you can also have a script, which is more of a documentary style. So then you have a presenter come in and explain. That's a lot more like the American podcast style, where you have a lot of presenting and a lot of script. I think it's also worth thinking about who it is, because you want it to be representative of the subject, and you don't want to talk on behalf of other people if it's not your story to tell. I think it's always worth thinking about that. early on. And then the other voices. So again, you can hear a little bit with something like the Robert Wyatt. If you go for a very simple format, and I make a lot of podcasts that are very simple, I'm showing and playing more of the sound rich stuff because I think people want to hear about sound here, and I love making those. But realistically, you know, I do make a lot of really simple stuff, and I love making that as well. And what I'd say is that the crucial thing with that is the voices, the picking your people. If it's just an interview, then you really need to think about who those people are, and that's kind of what I said in that Robert Wyatt thing. And then if it's multiple voices, you might want to have a range of different views. That's a kind of BBC way, but I just think in terms of diversity and in terms of different takes on a subject, that's a good journalistic practice, to have different ideas rather than all the same people agreeing, or just agreeing as kind of a political way of thinking about it, but just with the same sort of take on a subject maybe isn't as interesting. So yeah, you pick those other voices, and then sound. So at the very get-go, we'll go into the details of how it's made, but I think when you're thinking about using sound, you want to think about it at the very, very beginning. So people now, if you're working with a sound designer, you often get the sound designer in at the very early stages, which is kind of new. I mean, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes people just put the sound in at the end because it's seen as a kind of coloring in, but actually sound's part of the narrative. It's almost one of your voices. So you want to think about that at the beginning and how you're going to make it work, particularly if you're going to be recording everything. So you need to think about your different recordings that you're going to need to get when you do an interview with somebody, if you want to build a scene and all these sort of things, which I'll go into in more detail. And then lastly, who is it for? Like, who's your podcast for? I think that's often thought of as kind of like, I think of that as kind of BBC question, but actually I think that's kind of really relevant no matter what you're making, because the great thing with podcasts is you don't have to be generalist. You don't have to do what the BBC does. You can be really, really niche, but I think it's still worth knowing that your niche audience might know all these things, but they don't necessarily, if you talk about something really specialist elsewhere, those terms aren't necessarily going to be known. So it's just continually explaining things that might need to be explained, and being aware of when you don't need to explain things to a certain audience. If your audience knows all about, sound, you don't necessarily need to go into like minute detail in those sort of things. And yeah, it just helps sort of focus your mind on having an audience as well. I think sometimes the risk with podcasts is because there's no interaction with your audience. With radio, definitely with live radio, you get tweets in and all this. And sometimes with documentaries, you get feedback. With podcasts, there's a thing where you just put podcasts out. No, you just don't really know anybody's ever listening to them. And it's just like, sounds like you're kind of shouting into a vacuum. And I think the risk with that is that you forget that people are there listening. And if you forget that they're there, you can kind of, the conversations can sound quite in and quite exclusive and a little bit alienating. So just always be aware that there's a third person there that's the microphone, and you might just need to explain when somebody's doing something with their hands that's what's happening, or they're gesturing to do this. And if nobody's explaining that for the listeners, then it's just generally a bit of a sort of alienating listen. So yeah, think about your audience and talk to them, get to know them. So I wanted to play you another clip. This is not a podcast, but it is a radio program I made just as the pandemic was coming in, actually, and then put it out in last year. And I think it's an interesting, it answers some of those questions that I've just posed in an interesting way. So like, who is telling the story? Let's just go back. Who's telling the story? What voices do you hear? How is sound integral to the story? The audience is Radio 3 audience, it's quite general audience, but maybe just think about those questions listening to this.
And my approach, where everybody was trying to imitate and try to use synthesizer to create traditional sounds of sitar and guitar, I said, why are we doing that? This is a completely new world. So I imagined that I'm traveling on a space journey and I'm sitting in a space liner, and I was trying to think what kind of music or rather sound spectrum must be there out in the space. It cannot be Blue Danube composed by Strauss as in the Space Odyssey 2001. So it has to be something different. And David loved that approach because he realized that I was looking at the synthesizer from a totally different perspective.
Jin Raj had some pretty wild plans for the synthesizer. He thought it could be used to translate animal communication or create an underwater language for submarines. When David Tudor left India, Jin Raj wrote him a series of obsessively detailed and animated letters explaining his grand plans for the Moog. Tudor put in a good word with the Rockefeller Music Research Center in San Diego, who offered him a scholarship to study sound synthesis. What happened with that part of your life? Did that...
No, I couldn't go to Rockefeller Music Research Center. My father said, finish architecture. So that was the end of the musician. And I very, very disappointed for a 19-year-old boy, very disappointed, because it gave me a chance to go to America. And I was being fully paid. My father didn't have to spend the money, but he thought that this is crazy. You're not going to get a job after 9 months. And so he looked at it from a pragmatic way, like every Indian father. But then those opportunities don't come again. And I never had a time to reflect and go back to it. This interview, after 50 years, somebody even cared to call me and find me as valuable. That just is more fascinating than anything I've ever happened in my life. It was the best gift in 70 years. When you are working for a living, your creativity is subdued because you are dancing to other people's tune. Now I have to create my own tune and dance to it.
So that was Jin Raj. I dropped you in a bit cold there without really explaining the context, but that was a documentary Sunday feature for Radio 3, and it was about a box of tapes that you can see in this picture here that the Paul Purgas, an artist and musician, had found in the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, East India. And he'd gone there because he'd read an article about a Moog synthesizer that had been brought to the country in the 60s. It was a kind of incredible period in just after independence, and Le Corbusier was there, and Alexander Calder, and the kind of great and the good of the modernists, and amazingly a kind of Moog found its way there, and he'd read about it, so he went on the trail of the Moog actually originally, didn't find the Moog but did find these tapes, and then
once he listened to them, he was kind of stunned, because there's the kind of really synth space sound that you hear after Blue Danube is some of those tapes. And they basically opened up a whole new chapter in Indian electronic music that nobody had realized was there. It was really like genuinely exciting, because I guess we think of electronic music, we associate it with maybe, you know, Germany or Detroit, and even tape music, you know, with Europe. So yeah, that was a really great project to work on. I mean, it was a gift as a story. It was just a gift. And I guess in terms of like those questions, the reason why it sort of answers those questions really well, like one, it is meant to be a radio document. Like that's a really good radio story, because it's about sound. There's these tapes that haven't been heard. You get to hear them first. There was a lot of radio tapes where they like have these radio programs talking about electronics and like the excitement of electronics. It was also personal for Paul. So in terms of like why this person is telling the story, Paul, you know, he had an investment in it. He's a musician himself. He's an electronic musician. He's of Indian descent. And so for him, it was really moving to kind of realize that he has sort of forebears in India. He doesn't have to continually look to kind of Detroit for like the beginnings of dance music. I mean, maybe that's a bit far, but there was definitely stuff going on. And then, in terms of the audience, I mean, I like maybe playing with Strauss for a Radio 3 audience is kind of, I quite like those things where I get to sort of have a bit of fun. Like you kind of lead someone down a path with sound, playing Blue Danube, and it sounds a bit traditional, and then it stops and it's something else. Maybe I played with the audience's expectations there a bit because it's a classical network, but generally Radio 3 audiences, actually, you can have quite in-depth documentaries about sort of sound and history and music. Their documentaries are actually really worth checking out. Not many people know that Radio 3 do really interesting and in-depth kind of arts documentaries. So that's that. Break time. What time is it? Have I got, did I time it quite well? Wow, okay, so we've got half an hour left.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I mean, this is actually kind of like questions, just sort of if people need to reset or like get a drink or have a cup of tea, but equally, if you just want to keep on rolling and ask me some questions. I mean, it sounds like really the stuff that a lot of people is really engaged by is the sound specific questions. Let me just have a look in the chat and see.
We've not had any new questions, but yeah, I'm sure everyone's really interested in the next part.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Like the pacing of this program. Yeah, thank you very much. The music's definitely one. It was something that Radio 3 are very keen on, is having listening to the music. Radio 4, they don't want you to play as much music. They have kind of rules, but you can play with them a bit, but they like to have short chats because it's not a music network. Whereas Radio 3, they deliberately said, actually, can we really hear the tapes? Because I think that's going to be really interesting to people. So I might just take this opportunity to just to close down like all of these things and see if that helps. There we go, because there's something really sticky with this. There we go. Okay, so sound rich, sound design, listening. I found this quote recently by Alvin Lucier. I don't know if anybody knows him. He died very recently. Avant-garde composer, played a lot with sort of recorded sound and format and frequency. But it got me to thinking actually that it's a really good quote for radio. Again, it comes back to this thing of like listening to what you're making and really respecting what it needs. And sometimes it needs silence, and like that's okay. sometimes something really emotional needs space, and you don't want to kind of lead. I mean, this is personal, I guess, but I would be inclined. I just don't enjoy things that have too much leading sound to sort of suggest emotion. If it's already there, it's already there. It's the interesting difference, I think, between film and radio. When it's just sound, you can really overdo it. And sometimes even when I'm watching films, I get kind of overwhelmed by the sound because there's so much, this is the kind of Hollywood type stuff, but there seems to be just so much like emotional sound in films sometimes. And yeah, then if I listen to what I'm making, I'm like, God, I really want to have just like loads and loads of space. So yeah, that kind of leads me on to this stuff about sound, which is Kelly in this? Maybe she's, yeah. So they're all edits are unique, and think about what yours needs. What is the format that you've got? Have you got an interview with a round table? Say you've got 3 people talking, and and you're presenting it, and you're asking them questions. Do you need sound in that to make a scene? Because it might be a bit confusing to a listener to be in a room with people and then suddenly they're in a farmyard halfway through, they're talking about farms, and so you put the sounds of farms in the background. So maybe that's a bit discombobulating, because actually what's enjoyable about a conversation in a podcast like that might be that actually we're all hanging out in this room together, and that these are my friends and they're talking about farms. That's interesting. And they might not need to be transported to the farm they're talking about. That's what I would suggest. But why not? It's not conventional, but maybe it might work there, and it might be a bit of fun. But it's just thinking, what is your format, and what does it need? And then again, like, plan sound from the start and record lots of options. So I'm going to play you another clip from New Way Britain, because and then I'm going to show you the project, because this plays with sound in a particular way. And I just want to give you a sense of like how many things I recorded and what I did to make something that sounds kind of just like it's a background. It maybe doesn't sound like that impressive, but there's a lot in there. And that's because before I even went there, I said so also Kelly, you might remember Kelly, she did a previous one of these, Kelly Jane Jones, she's amazing, sound artist, who works with Vox. So before I went to interview Kelly for this, I said to her, I really want to get a few things while we're there to build the scene. So I'm probably gonna record the atmosphere when I arrive. It was in an old factory where her studio is. This episode was about musicians who've been pushed to the edgelands of big cities because of cuts. And so I wanted the sound of the edge of a city, basically, and in Manchester. And then I said, right, so is there anything we can do on site that has particular sounds that might be good? And she's like, oh yeah, there's this skip full of offcuts, we'll go in there. And then I said, okay, great, we'll do that. And then, is there anything like you can demo me when we get there? Can you play me some stuff? Do you have the rocks? So we ended up recording an interview with them in the studio, an interview with them outside, walking in and walking up the steps. I ended up recording the outside, which you always do, and the inside, which you always do. But then I also recorded this skip. I recorded a few separate sounds, just isolated. And then I recorded her demoing her stuff in the studio, which was like playing. But then I also recorded her just doing single notes, one after the other. So I kind of, you're a bit like a painting, you're getting lots of things on your palette. So when you come to build that scene, you can daub a little bit of a close-up sound effect, daub a little bit of the background on it, and you slowly kind of layer up a whole picture. So with that in mind, maybe you can hear those little bits in the clip. Really hope it's in there. Yeah.
What sort of music is it that you actually make?
Oh, it's so hard. I guess
one has.
It's a kind of a mixture between
herb,
experimental music,
we threw the meaning,
rock music, without the guitars, it's abstract. Let's see if that works. External in. Sorry. Hello. I amplify rocks. So this is a big bit of slate, and on top of the slate I've got some rocks, some rose quartz. I kind of gravitate first of all to the shape, some amazonite, I've got a singing bowl, the colours, that kind of thing. We come from rocks, you know, the minerals that are in them is like, that's what makes up our bodies.
Do you get fed up of people asking you if you make rock music?
Oh God. I mean, I do giggle, but I've kind of looked up loads of phrases with the words rock in. Rock bottom, on the rocks, getting your rocks off. And actually that's a quote from Jung, like the psychoanalyst as well. He talks about...
Get your rocks off. He said that.
He's talking about sitting on a rock. Is the rock sitting on me, or am I sitting on the rock?
I'm pretty sure you're sitting on the rock, Carl.
So there you go. A little bit of levity alongside the beauty of her rock compositions. Yeah, there's some really good questions in the chat. So I'm going to accelerate through. This next bit is for the sound specific stuff. And then I can do a bit on like actually practically platforms and editing stuff yourself and all that. So I have seen that. Okay, I'm going to try and do a new share. Let's see. Yep. It's pretty. Oh God, why isn't my mouse? Sorry, it's just really sticky and I don't know why. Okay, let's try and come out of that. Okay, share. Okay.
That looks good. Yeah, we can see it.
You can see that. Good. Just there's Kelly's, but if not, you know what, there's Kelly's, but it's being a bit temperamental. So I'm gonna play this. I actually got loads of time left, have we? I'm gonna play this because it's a bit more simple. So it might be more akin to like what you might be doing if you're making a podcast. This is a podcast for Summerset House. To clarify, I do all of this myself. So there isn't actually a team. I like this idea of there's a team that does your editing and half of your recording. I do everything. So that won't happen even when you work for BBC. Really, it's like Americans style productions increasingly have that, but yeah, it's a good skill to learn. If you're doing your own podcast, it will actually be like that. If you're like doing your own documentary, maybe you have a researcher, that's sort of. So yeah, in terms of layering sound, this is about the Beano exhibition that's at Summerset House at the moment. It's an artist-led podcast, and it's kind of an artist he's at the end. He's an artist and creator of the Beano exhibition. He's at the end of the process, and he wants to talk about this idea of kind of the art of breaking the rules, and the Beano in particular. So what I did was I went to record him in his studio, but I wanted to build the scene a little bit and have a bit more fun with it because it's the Beano, it's meant to be a bit fun and risky and rebellious. So I recorded him like rummaging through stuff in the studio, and then I also recorded an interview with him, and then I also put music in it. So this is just 3 layers, but it's already gets you somewhere, and you could easily do this for a podcast that you're making, and it's not like crazy amounts of layers. So
here I've got a very tacky red and black catapult that came free with one of the Beanos. A little bit disappointing. What else have we got in the box? My normal answer is that my name is Andy Holden. That much I know. I'm an artist who makes films and animations and installations, and currently I'm wearing a red and black striped curator's hat and doing an exhibition at Summerset House called The Art of Breaking the Rules, which is about the Beano and its influence on art. That's the sound of eyeballs falling out of a pair of fake spectacles. And we're currently, though, in my studio, which is my converted upholstery workshop in suburban Bedford. I'll do some more fun summers. I guess we're just going to have to go through it. I'm going to have to demo the whoopee cushion, aren't I? Would I describe myself as a rule breaker? I mean, I'm not sure you set out to be deliberately rebellious, but on the other hand, I don't have a huge amount of regard for the way things are normally done. I think, yeah, like I perversely enjoy upending expectation. I think play is important. I mean, and there is something about bending and breaking the rules in play, in the sense that in play, the rules are kind of at least tested. You know, you have a structure, but then they can evolve.
Okay, I'm not going to play lots and lots of that, but I think that gives you a sense. So someone was asking specifically about the balance, the mix. So this is Reaper, by the way. I use Reaper. I love Reaper, but there's lots of different, as I'm sure you're aware, because you work in sound, there's loads of different piece of software you can use. It's kind of what you know and what you like, really. But Reaper's good, it's cheap. And it's got a lot of sort of customizable elements to it. Not that I use lots of them, but they're there if you are that way inclined. And yeah, so here, I mean, you could go into lots of detail, but essentially, like when you are mixing with music, so here there's speech. This is the speech track. This one, Andy Holden, the green one. This one is the field recording track. And this blue one is music. You want to have your music low and
at least tested.
Like, I like having visual editing so that I can see visually that this music is now low or it's off entirely. And here it's high, that you can see with the waveform. So I should zoom in a little bit more. You can see that's high.
I think, yeah, like I perversely enjoy upending expectation. I think.
And a little bit of the Fran Panetta style there. I like doing things with rhythm sometimes. So here, very, very small. Most people wouldn't notice it, but that's the eyeballs. So if you, that's those springy eyeballs, you know, the ones that you get in joke shops. And then that's the music, and they're actually synchronized. So it's just small details that I quite like playing with. It's kind of like musical editing. And again, so it's to kind of get like the Beano, you can sort of do that sort of thing, right? That's what it's USP. Yeah, I mean, look, there's like panning as well. You can pan your people. So there's later on, there's an interview, and I've kind of put them at like slightly left and slightly right, so it sort of feels like there's a bit of a stereo field. But this, I guess, just shows you that, like, you know, you can create a little bit of interesting sound even if you're just doing it yourself and it's not an enormous production and there's not a lot, like loads of time. I asked Andy in advance, I said, like, I'm going to come to your studio and I'd really like to have some things to record. Is there any toys? Have you got any art that makes sounds? Is there just anything? Sometimes I just get people leafing through paper. So like here, for example, I get him to read.
Yes. This
This is Calamity James. This would be a Tom Patterson drawing.
And here, like, I probably got him just, I mean, I can just destroy this edit a bit for you, but. Well, usually I'd just say, look, can you just crinkle those papers? Just give me the crinkling. Let's do 10 seconds of crinkling. Give me 20 seconds of the eyes. So then I've got them, and I can, you don't want them with people talking over them, because it's harder to kind of manipulate. And then, yeah, and then I'd lay like the music. I tend to put music in that is pacing, so to sort of help with a bit of story that's maybe more, that's got more detail in it, that's kind of a bit sciencey, or it's like an explainer that can help. This music is my explaining music. It's kind of like, look,
this is Calamity Jane.
And this one is like intro music in a way, because it sort of sets the tone of it. But yeah, it's kind of, some of the stuff's just really instinctive, and it's just about listening to what you think works. I try loads of different things out. I can take like days to find the right music. Sometimes it really can like bother me. And a piece of good advice that Axel Coutier gave is to listen with your body. He's a musician and sound designer, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about sound, because sometimes I close my eyes to get the pacing right, because otherwise you can edit everything and it's really quick and it just doesn't sound, it's like no space.
We had a question about music from Maria. How do you get around the licensing? And if you're using a recorded clip by the artist who you're interviewing, does that avoid the licensing problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for this, for example, like this is a podcast. So technically podcasts, the rule is you can't use music basically, unless you contact the publisher. It's not just about the artist, because the artist doesn't always own their publishing. If it's a small artist and you get their permission and they don't have a publisher, it's fine. But if it's somebody who's published or got a label, then it's trickier. But yeah, generally it's just better to avoid music. So I tend to get things composed, but again, that's when you've got a budget, and you can use stuff that's out of public domain, and there's sites like Free Sound's quite good for like sound effects, and there's the Free Music Archive, where it has certain rules on, you can use stuff if you credit and list it at the end. So here, for example, like this is a piece that I commissioned for the intro by an artist called Carbed, who I really like. And this
is Calamity James.
Was a sound designer who I asked him to do that sort of sound. So I kind of commission the sound and then they make it for me. But yeah, some people, if you're a musician, it's like a gift, because you can like go and make those stems. But you do need to be careful if you're a podcast maker and you're using music that is licensed and you haven't licensed it yourself. I'm aware there's some other, we could spend a lot of time on a project. I'm aware there's some other questions, so maybe it'd be better to move to that.
Yeah, it'd be good to hear, because we've got about, well, a bit over 5 minutes left. It'd be good to hear about the funding questions, like getting your podcast out, which platforms to use, and also, yeah, getting funding bids, how to move up the ladder.
Yes, yeah. So that's kind of it. Let me know if there's anything else on sound. I sped through that, but maybe it's helpful to see it in situ. But in terms of the pitching, here is some very simple resources. That's kind of the headlines. Again, this is kind of, there's loads of other places, like you can actually try and seek Arts Council funding as well. I tend to work with clients or the BBC, so I don't actually often seek my own funding for a project that I've come up with. So I'm just not the best person on that particular thing. But I'll put some resources in the chat that's specifically on pitching, and like goes into a lot more granular detail onto where and like communities that you can get involved with and networks that are really helpful on this. So but yeah, the main ones, I mean, if you do one of the BBC routes, there is rounds. They do once a year arts rounds, once a year factual rounds. for Radio 4, then there's Radio 3 and World Service as well. You would need to go through an independent production company, really, unless they know you and you're a producer. But I'm pretty sure you need to go through an indie always now. So that's about doing your research and working out who's the best company for you. Different companies have very different styles and they have kind of expertise, different producers. If you're starting out, even if you're not starting out, if you haven't done anything for the BBC before, they probably will pair you with a producer, and the producer will kind of train you up and you'll co-produce it. And then your second production, you can probably fly solo. But that's great. So maybe I'd say then it's worth like doing research on a producer that you like their work, contact them and say, look, I've got this idea. They'll then sit down with you. And they'll probably actually, before sitting down with you, just want a kind of paragraph on what it is, just to see if it's viable. If they think it's viable, then they'll help you develop it a little bit and have conversations with you. Then they'll put it into around, the format is a short 250 word pitch for the first round. If they like it, they come back and say yes, and then you do like a whole one-sider. And then if they like that, then it's commissioned. And you usually have about a year and a half to make it. So it's quite a long process. If you're thinking about something that's happening in the next 6 months, it's not going to be suitable for a BBC round, because it's just going to, I mean, they do actually have separate commissioning options for that, but they generally take people that are quite kind of experienced for those really short turnaround things. There is other places, like there's the Spotify and the Audibles. They tend to look for quite commercial ideas. So by all means, if you've got something in that realm, listen to the stuff they already do and sort of think if that's suitable. I think they quite like big names. It might not be suitable for this particular. I'm getting a sense that this is more sort of DIY. I think, Resonance has ClearSpot, has a space for experimental radio docs. I don't think it paid, but it's a nice place to showcase your work. There's lots of internet. I'm sure some of you have said that you do shows on internet radio and community radio. Again, this is the thing about it, that those places are probably more accessible, but they won't give you budget, I imagine. And then increasingly the do-it-yourself thing is actually being increasingly seen as a more viable option for companies, because there's this kind of growth in the originals model, which means that it's the Netflix model and Spotify and Audible, where you grow your own production and you then get advertising off the back of it. So if you've got a really good idea and you don't want to sell it to anyone, and you're happy to maybe make it for quite a long time without an enormous budget or any budget, but you see the longevity in it, then you could potentially build up enough of a community to get advertising. But that takes a long time. I've seen it done. It can be done, but it's just about commitment there. So the BBC is still kind of, in a way, it's still the easiest way to get in if you want to produce stuff and get paid. But it is still quite difficult. It's difficult to get something commissioned. So then it's about matching yourself with an independent production company and them kind of having faith in you, and the strength of the idea. People they don't mind if you haven't got a lot of experience. If you've got a good idea, that's what sells it. So it's kind of honing those ideas for radio. And then training, if you want to get more training, there's lots of different places. I can give some links to these, but Audio Train is very good. Strange and Charmed is run by Kathy Fitzgerald, who's a very interesting maker in her own right. She's a documentary maker. She might have paused over the pandemic, but it's worth keeping an eye on her anyway if you like radio. She's really good. The BBC Academy does like talks and things as well. There's also Third Coast. There's a few podcasts where they kind of showcase really interesting work. The Third Coast one is called what's it called? Resound. So yeah, I mean, I'm aware that I'm just sort of blurting out information.
That's fine. Do you want to stop screen share just to say goodbye for the last minute? And we also thought that if you send us the resources, we can just include them in the final email. Might be easier than trying to put them all in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can do that.
Cool.
There's one last thing, which is the resources for the pitching in particular. I'll put a link to like a whole other presentation that goes really in depth into that. So you can find that there.
Amazing. Thank you. Oh, that was so interesting. So interesting to hear about your life and your career. And yeah, that bit at the end was golden as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you everybody else. And look out in your inboxes for the post-seminar email that'll have some extra nuggets in. This was the last seminar in the series. So it will be available on YouTube, maybe on the website, I'm not sure, next year at some point. So yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you, Yorkshire Sound Women's Network, for hosting. It's been amazing. And yeah, I hope everyone got lots of value from it. Feel free to turn on your mic at the end if you just want to say goodbye.
Thanks everybody for coming. I hope it wasn't too
thank you
mad at the beginning. It sounds right, but it's really interesting to hear from you all. Also, I'll put my contact if anybody wants to like follow up with specific questions or anything. I'm always all ears to people's questions.
Great. Thanks everybody.